Good afternoon. I'm excited you are joining us for this Friends of the Alameda Free Library author talk. My name is Kevis Brownson, and I will be your moderator for this event with best-selling author Sarah Penner. Before we get started, I'll review a few technical details. This is a live webinar and it will be recorded. The audio for the audience is muted and the video is turned off, so you will only see the presenters and presentation. Please use chat to introduce yourself and to ask questions. We monitor the chat. Please use kindness and respect in your comments and questions. There will be a question and answer session, and I'll relay your questions to Sarah, but please jot them down in the chat at any point in the webinar. The volunteers with Friends at Home learn more about hosting webinars with each event. We have practice, but issues may arise, and we work hard to create a great experience for everyone. Before I introduce Sarah, I want to tell you about the Friends of the Alameda Free Library. The Friends is a nonprofit organization that raises funds and advocates for an outstanding public library in Alameda. During the pandemic, the Friends remained committed to our role as a library support organization. Since the shutdown, our virtual docent and author talks had more than 4,000 attendees and many YouTube views. Please consider a donation to the Friends in any amount that is comfortable for you via our website, alamedafriends.com, or through the link we'll be posting in the chat. Now, on to our program. We are delighted to welcome Sarah Penner, author of New York Times bestseller, The Lost Apothecary, her debut novel. Her book, an international bestseller in Canada, Belgium, Sweden, and Spain, will be translated into 40 languages worldwide. Sarah Penner, welcome.
Thank you so much, Kevis. Thank you for having me, and thank you to everyone who's tuning in. I'm thrilled to be here.
Thanks. We're just thrilled that you could join us all the way on the West Coast. Is this your first opportunity to reach people in California?
You know, it's funny. I mostly do events with people on the East Coast, a few Central, and then I think that out of more than 150 events, I think that I've probably done less than 10 with the West Coast. And obviously the time zone is part of that because it's 8 o'clock here. And I appreciate you all being flexible with your schedules because if I recall correctly, normally you would meet a little bit later. So I'm appreciative of this, just for my own sanity. And it's funny, I'm in my home office right now in St. Petersburg, Florida. And normally I would have maybe done something a little nicer with my hair, but I mentioned to you earlier, I was on the road for about 5 hours today, coming from a different event in North Florida. So you all who are tuning in tonight are getting to see the real Sarah Penner, no makeup, hair up, just a kind of a tank top on. So it's good though. I mean, this is, I would rather be real and have you all have the opportunity to see kind of what an average weekday night is like for me. So I love that I'm at a place where I'm comfortable enough with these types of events to be able to be really informal and casual, and hopefully many of you are all the same.
So I think that you wanted to tell us a little bit about developing your book and about some other aspects of the book. So don't hesitate, just dive
absolutely
right.
So typically, how these work best, I will just kind of talk away for maybe 10 or 15 minutes about my inspiration for the story and some of my research. And then absolutely, as you have questions, we can cover them later in this presentation. At this point, I really think I've been asked almost every possible question under the sun. So don't be shy. And if there's something I don't want to answer, I won't answer. But I'm very much an open book. And I guess the pun there is intended. But there's, whether you want to talk about writing process, The Lost Apothecary, what's next, I would love to take any and all questions, from the audience. So The Lost Apothecary, it is my debut novel. Somehow, still, I pinch myself every day. Somehow it was a bestseller, like right out the gate. I have a background in finance, which is interesting. And I always like to tell people this, that I do not have any formal writing education or training. I don't have an MFA. I was a finance degree. And right out of college, I went to work for a large private company. And I worked in corporate America in various finance roles for 13 years. And during that time, I dabbled a little bit with writing, and I decided in my late 20s, I'm 35 now, I decided in my late 20s, I wanted to try my hand at writing a book. And I spent about a year writing a book. It was not The Lost Apothecary. It was a different story. And I queried about 100 literary agents with that book, and every single one of them rejected that manuscript. So I went back to the drawing board, and I came up with a different idea. And that second idea was The Lost Apothecary. And the reason why if I kind of explain why that first manuscript was rejected left and right by agents, it was because in that story, there were two female characters who were kind of pitted against each other. And we saw them really at odds through much of the story, and things kept happening to them. And then at the end, a man kind of enters the picture and resolves and cleans up a lot of the issues. And when I talked to literary agents about why they were rejecting the story, one of the main reasons was what I just described. They said, you can't have these women pitted against each other the entire story. You can't have things happening to them. They need to control their own destinies. And also, we can't have a man just coming in at the end of the book and fixing the problems. So when I set out to write The Lost Apothecary, I went the complete other direction. I wanted the women not only to be controlling their own fates and making their own decisions, but instead of a man solving their problems, I wanted them to be solving their problems, which were in some instances the men themselves. So agents seemed to love that. And I had 5 agents offer to represent me after I wrote The Lost Apothecary. I ultimately signed with an agent in New York, and she sold the book overnight to HarperCollins. So it was a vastly different success story for me personally. The idea about an apothecary specifically, I've always in my own life liked a lot of things that kind of relate to an apothecary's world. So for instance, I love herbal teas. If I have an upset stomach, I'm not going to go for the Pepto-Bismol. I'm going to go for a cup of hot ginger tea. I love chamomile tea. I just really like teas. I have a whole drawer of them. I also like essential oils. I don't use lotion. I make my own little essential oil blends with different oils and scents that I like. I make my own bug spray. I live here in Florida. We have a ton of bugs. So I make my own bug spray. So I kind of like that stuff anyways. I love cooking. I cook almost every night. I like gardening. And one of the reasons why I'm saying all this and why this is important is because when you are going to spend a year writing a book, a year revising it and selling it, and kind of this path to publication, you need to be almost obsessed with the topic at hand. And I knew that I would be interested in the research for this book as I continued to explore different herbal remedies and what they might be used for, and what a day in the life of an apothecary might look like. So I decided I wanted to write a book about an apothecary, but I knew I wanted her to be working and living in London. So interestingly, I used to travel there all the time when I was working in finance. So in this way, my background in corporate America was completely tied to what I'm now doing with my life, which is writing full time, because I'd only gone to London because of my job. So I knew I wanted this apothecary set in my favorite city in the world, which is London. However, I knew that there needed to be something sinister about her. I could not have an apothecary merely selling headache and stomachache remedies. I wanted there to be more intensity to the story. I needed the stakes to be higher. I needed this to be about life and death and pregnancies and affairs and all of these really compelling topics that would make a reader of thrillers and mysteries want to pick up the book. So that led me into poison. I had no prior knowledge of poison prior to the story. And I would say that most of my research for this book was about different poisons. So my bookshelf is full of all of these really cool resources about plant poisons and real life poisoning homicide cases in the 19th century in Britain. And if you are interested in these topics, there's a more comprehensive list of resources on my website that you can definitely look at. So I spent a lot of time researching poisons. I also went mudlarking. So I get that question a lot. If I went mudlarking as part of my research, it wasn't necessarily part of my research, but I did after the book was written and before we sold it. I went to London and I went mudlarking 3 separate times along the River Thames, which runs, right through central London, of course. And I was on a quick event just before this one, and they asked me to do a little show and tell with the things that I found while mudlarking. So I have it handy right here next to me. This is a little piece of a clay pipe, and I'm sorry if that's not really in focus. This camera is kind of finicky, but this is a fragment of a clay pipe, which is mentioned in the book. There are billions of these in the River Thames because these used to be essentially what cigarettes are today. They're one-time use. This would have been the stem, and then this was the barrel that they would stuff with tobacco, smoke it one time, throw it in the river as just kind of, rubbish. I found a lot of clay pieces. This is a dark blue. Sorry about that zooming issue. There we go. Just a lot of different kind of pieces like that. Interestingly, they use the blue dye all the time. So I have this whole bag full of cool things. But if anybody's on Instagram, if you go way to the very bottom, when I first started posting on Instagram, you can see a whole spread of things that I found, when I was in London mudlarking. So that was really fun. If anybody's listening and wants to go mudlarking, which I do highly recommend, just remember that you have to have a permit, and they have plainclothed police who do ask to see the permit. And if you don't produce it, they will fine you. So be sure that you have that. So let's see, we've talked about the inspiration for the story. We've talked about mudlarking, a little bit about research. I did, let's see. So The Lost Apothecary came out in March 2021, a little over a year ago. It's important to note that after we sold the book, I still kept working my day job. I was determined to sell my second book before I quit my job. And I just wanted to make sure that I didn't have this single lucky, fortunate incident in my life. And I was just very determined. I was going to sell my second book before I quit my job. So about the week that The Lost Apothecary came out, and it was evident it was going to be successful. We had some indicators pretty early on that it was going to do well. I sent over a 1-page pitch about my next book idea to my editor, and they bought my next book off of that single page pitch. And so as soon as we had that offer in hand, I typed up my formal resignation from corporate America and sent it over to my boss. So my 13-year tenure in finance came to a swift and welcome end. And now I'm a full-time writer. That pitch that I just referenced was for my next book titled The London Seance Society. It comes out in April of 2023, so roughly 1 year from now. And the book is essentially written and completed. We're just getting ready to delve into copy edits, which we'll work on through the summer. And I cannot wait for this book to come out. I just a few hours ago put up a summary of the book on my website for those of you who have who are interested in knowing kind of more what it's about. But in short, it is anyone who loves high Victorian London, ghostly settings, seances, the rise of spiritualism in the 1860s and 1870s in London. And then anyone who is interested in this idea of truth versus illusion, particularly as it relates to paranormal type activity, I think will love this book. It features, of course, strong women who find themselves in precarious situations. Nearly every chapter ends on a cliffhanger, much like The Lost Apothecary. It's a very quick-paced historical mystery. And I think that my writing has improved greatly since The Lost Apothecary. I think it's a better book. And I just adore it. And I cannot wait for readers to find it in bookshelves next April. So I've done a lot of talking, and I've seen a few questions come through. So maybe I'll pause there, take a drink of water, and Kevis, I will wait for you to tell me what I should talk about next.
I think we can go to the questions. So I have one actually. It seems from your talk that you really started with the idea of this time period and finding somebody in this historical time period. What led you to put a dual timeline into the book? Because you obviously didn't have to do that to tell, the story, but what made that happen?
Yeah, absolutely. So I knew that, so Nella, of course, she's the apothecary. She's essentially the central character in The Lost Apothecary. I knew that I wanted her methods of disguise, both with her poisons and then also with her shop. I wanted her methods of disguise to be so effective that none of her contemporaries could locate her or identify her as the culprit. And this applied to the police as well as reporters and the media and what have you. So if I knew that I wanted her to go to her grave being undiscovered, we still have to somehow figure out what her story is. And I wanted to do that through the lens of a woman in contemporary London who is dealing and grappling with her own life situations. And I wanted her to be the one to make the discovery. And I think that Nella, if you were to ask her, she would have said the exact same thing. I think she would have said, I want nobody in my own era to find me and to learn my secrets. But someday when I'm long gone, I want a woman who will benefit from my secrets to find out about me. So also, if you think about the title of the book, The Lost Apothecary, that was the title from the advent of the idea. Often in this industry, book titles are changed and the publishers kind of decide what the book title is going to be. This was my title on my very first notebook where I started jotting down ideas, and nobody ever questioned, challenged, or proposed a change to the title. So if you think about The Lost Apothecary, anytime something is lost, that implies it can be found. And so I just always knew Nella was going to be, her secrets were going to be discovered. But it was going to be hundreds of years later when her shop had sort of started to disintegrate, beneath these buildings down these back alleyways. And it's interesting because my next book that I mentioned, the London Seance Society, it is not dual timeline. It is all set in high Victorian London. And that serves the purpose for the story because there are no secrets that need to be found later. Everything is kind of uncovered by these women in the book real time, and the reader gets to follow along with that. So I think every story is a little bit different. Dual timeline is not for the faint of heart, and I needed a break before reapproaching that type of story structure because it's very tricky to pull off.
I can imagine, and it sounds really fun to delve into the seance world.
Yes.
When that comes out, I can't wait. So I've got a question from the audience, and I want to remind people, please put your questions in the chat, and we'll get to them. So the question is, what has it been like becoming so well known so quickly?
Gosh, I was born and raised in a little log cabin in Kansas, very humble roots. And my parents, they always instilled in me that there will always be people in life that have more than you and people that have less than you. And I think that the way that I was raised has been really good, a very good foundation for me as I've kind of experienced a shift in visibility. Nobody really knew who I was when I was working in finance. And then suddenly I have these people attending my events, and I will never know everybody's name, but they all seem to know mine. And I think I've really kept my head on straight because I constantly remind myself that this is fragile, and this is something that I'm really fortunate to have experienced. And I've also worked really, really hard for it. And so I don't take any of this for granted. And I try to also remind people that I'm just a human being. There's nothing special about me. When sometimes readers, when we're talking, especially in person, they say, how nervous they are, or I can tell that they're visibly nervous to be talking to me. And it's so odd for me because I'm just the same person I've always been. And my friends and my husband kind of attest to that, that I'm still a very imperfect person who just happened to write a book that has done well. So, it's been fun, but I really feel like I'm the same person I've always been. My job has just changed quite a bit.
Great. You've done so many events with this book, and that must be both gratifying and a little bit hard to keep track of sometimes. So do you ever find yourself coming and going and wondering what day it is? Or
So I'm a very organized person. I have my agenda that I keep that's handwritten. I also have a digital agenda. So when I have events like this, I have it in two places because God forbid I forget. I've not to this day missed a single event for scheduling purposes or forgetfulness. I'm very organized and very structured. I have zero problem saying no. So if I've got a day that's too full, or if I don't think I'm going to have the bandwidth, I'll just tell the person no. I also have a fabulous publicity team, and sometimes they say no on my behalf, which is much appreciated. I like the events. What's been nice is that I'm able to now be more selective than I used to be. And with the London Seance Society next spring, I will be doing a fraction of the events that I've done for the Lost Apothecary because they are very taxing and tiring. And because I have done so much for the Lost Apothecary and it was such a success, I'm able now to take a little step back. So, if we think about someone like Kristen Hanna, she has the luxury of just doing a handful of really large events. That's nowhere near where I'm at, but I also don't need to take on every single thing. So I'm now able to be a little more selective. And I look forward to a less rigorous publicity schedule for the next book. I think that will be refreshing.
I can imagine. So, okay, another question from the audience. How did you jump from finance to writing fiction? You mentioned you'd done a little writing over the years, but how did you decide to write a novel and feel your way into creating it without training in it? Did you plot out the book before you wrote it, or did it come together as you went along?
I'm shaking my head because I would be asking myself the same thing. I think maybe there was something deep inside me that it was larger than myself that just said, so I will say this, I like very challenging things. When my husband and I first met, he made it very well known very early that he really liked me. And I distinctly remember telling him, you are coming on too strong. I need a challenge. I need to chase a little bit. And it's the same with my work. If you are putting something easy in front of me, it's not nearly as compelling to me as if it's really difficult. And I knew when I started dabbling in writing in my 20s that breaking into the publishing industry was almost impossible. And because of that, I researched extensively. I went to conferences. I studied literally like what makes a book a bestseller. How do you craft a good story? I took so many classes and read so many books about how to do this, kind of all this self-taught work as I was toying with that first failed novel. And because I had this experience in corporate America, I knew also just how an industry works. And I knew that the publishing industry was going to be no different in that a book is essentially a product and they're trying to gauge what consumers like. And so I tried to keep that in mind as I wrote the book and think not just what do I want to do creatively, but what will the market be receptive to? And a perfect example is this. Many of us in different cities have seen these apothecary shops popping up everywhere. There's several in my city where they have the actual word apothecary in the name. They sell things like teas and candles and all of that. So I felt like I saw this industry trend toward apothecary type things. But if you went into a bookstore and looked for a fiction book about an apothecary, there was nothing there. So my business-minded brain capitalized on that. And I said, okay, I kind of like apothecary things. It seems to be sort of a popular trend. I'm brainstorming my next book, and there's no commercial fiction about an apothecary. And I need to write a book about strong, brave women, possibly harming or hurting men as a way to chase their own fate. And it all just came together perfectly. And so I think that in many ways, that business-minded sense has helped me as I've made strategic decisions about my career. And then so much of it too, I just have to say, is luck. It's an incredibly difficult industry to break into. And there are so many things, junctures of this experience that I've asked myself, I don't know how this happened. It truly is like something larger than me was at play.
Oh, that sounds so fascinating. You were right. More questions are popping up from our audience. So, when you shifted your focus in your first book from men saving the day to women embracing camaraderie and being in control of their destiny, did this feel more empowering and authentic to you personally?
1000%. It felt, yes, absolutely. And I have almost now, I don't want to say over embraced it, but I don't know how I could now write a story in which the women are not just total badasses taking control of the situation. I mean, the London Seance Society is in the similar vein in that we have two really strong women. Now they're not killing anybody in this book. But it's kind of going against the patriarchy and infiltrating this men's society, exclusive society. So, I have seen, I've become, much more feminist, I think, than I used to be, and started reading more books in which women are front and center stage. And, in some ways, the themes that I wrote about in The Lost Apothecary continue to affect me in bizarre ways, because I keep embracing this idea of like girl power and just women standing up for what they want. And it's funny to think that I wrote a book and now that book continues to teach me something, but that's how it seems to be working. And that's been very fun to experience firsthand.
So, more questions about your research are popping up. First of all, did you find a place similar to Bear Alley in your travels and research in London, and how was that for you?
So, for anybody who loves old maps, the map referenced a couple of times in the book, the John Roke map. I have several versions of it digitally, and then I also have it printed out. The Bear Alley, back alley, that is not a fictional location. Those streets, if you go look at these 18th century maps, really do exist. Now, back alley is obsolete. It's been built over, just kind of as described in the book. Bare alley does exist today. However, it's kind of just like a truly just an alleyway. If you go look at it on Google Maps, there's trash cans and not really much to speak of kind of in this industrial area or commercial area. So, it's funny because part of this book, it's obviously set in London, which is a real city. And so I had to find these unique ways to combine fact with fiction. I had no historical photos of Bear Alley, so I kind of used my imagination there. I will say that trip to London in 2019, when I went mudlarking, I was walking down a street kind of in the North Kensington area, and I took a picture of it on my phone. I wish I could easily access it to show you all. But there was this overgrown clearing and a gate. And then at the back of the clearing behind a shrub was this door. And I took a picture of it because it was just instantly like, this is in my book. This is what I have described in my book, almost exactly as I pictured it. And so for anyone who's had the luxury of just walking through London and kind of enjoying the sights and sounds around them, there's stuff like this everywhere. There's all kinds of cool doors that just are begging to be opened. And that's what I try to do in the book, is pose a scenario in which someone decides they want to break down that door and see what's behind it.
Oh, that's so cool. Another question from the audience. Did you do any of your research at the London Museum or any other?
Not the London Museum, but the British Library I've been to several times. I love the British Library. And if anybody can get a reader's pass, even us in the States. You don't have to be a resident of the UK. That said, you do have to wait in a queue for the materials that you request. That queue is at minimum several days and can be several weeks. So for an American like myself, trying to effectively and efficiently conduct research at the British Library, it's not practical. That said, there are so many fantastic resources that have been digitized by archivists and librarians online that are open access and free to use. And historical fiction authors like myself benefit greatly from that. So I looked through a number of pharmacopoeias, which is essentially a historical encyclopedia of drugs and remedies. There are so many of them bookmarked on my browser. And the beauty of that, not only are they free and I can access them any time of the day, but the archivists and librarians who've done this tedious work, you can search by the keywords. So let's say I needed to know what might have been prescribed for a headache in the late 1600s. You can just type in the keyword headache on some of these online resources, and it will highlight the pages where that word has been mentioned. And then you can go in and see what an apothecary would have been dispensing to someone who comes in with a headache. So the British Library, that was almost more, my visits to that were almost more for setting details and just having the experience of requesting a 300-year-old document and having it in front of me and experiencing how cool that is. It was more for that, as opposed to actually, going page by page, looking for remedies or what have you.
Oh, interesting. So, okay, another question from the audience. Do you have a special interest in history or English history in particular?
So very much like Caroline describes in the book, I hated history in high school and middle school. I thought it was completely dull and dry that we would read these history books full of the names of male politicians and battles and laws. And it's important information. I'm not denying that. But in terms of what interests me, not at all. That does not interest me. But just like Caroline says in the story, she is interested in the real lives of people who, and what their real experience was historically. So my access into this as a reader, because every writer is a reader first, my access into this was through historical fiction. So before I started writing, there were several historical fiction authors that really I fell in love with. One of the first books that I really loved and read was The Historian by Elizabeth Kostova. I love Ken Follett as well. And then Philippa Gregory. So these are all very different authors, of course, but those are the three authors who I started reading everything that they had out and realized, okay, there's Philippa Gregory is a little bit of an exception because she's talking a lot about the monarchy. But these were not filled with battles and politicians and all of that. These were about fictional characters who lived in a certain era, who were getting married or divorced or having illegitimate children, all of these fascinating scenarios to me. And I realized history does not have to be what we see in textbooks. It can be, and it is way more interesting. And we can access some of that through historical fiction. So that's where I'm at now. You could not pay me to open up a textbook. And I don't read any nonfiction about different historical events for the most part. One exception is I love Eric Larson. He's my favorite author. And his book, Dead Wake, I absolutely love that. His book about the hurricane in Galveston. I pretty much read anything that he writes. So he's an exception, but I would much rather pick up a historical fiction book than a textbook.
Great. So another question from the audience. What is your writing routine like?
Yes. So it depends where I am at with the different project that I'm working on. So, for instance, my next book, we are basically wrapped up with it. It's about to go into production. So I have not touched the manuscript this week, and it's Wednesday night. But tomorrow and Friday, I will be at my desk doing some line edits on the manuscript. When I was working in finance, I had to be more disciplined. So I wrote every day, roughly from 5 to 8 in the morning. And I'm a morning person. I'm energetic and creative in the mornings. So that was, kind of my schedule then, but now I have the luxury of not having to log into a day job at 8:30 in the morning. So I get more sleep than I used to, and I kind of write when I want to write. About, it was probably 5 or 6 weeks ago, I was doing a bit of a paperback tour because the paperback for The Lost Apothecary came out in February. And I had a deadline, a huge deadline coming up for the London Seance Society. And I was writing every spare moment during this tour. I was writing at the airport. I was writing at the hotel over breakfast and dinner. So it really varies based on, what I have going on and what deadlines are in place. I have made it very well known to my entire team and to my social media following that I am taking this summer off. So when I hand my kind of final draft in probably next week, I'm essentially taking the summer off, and I will sit down this fall with my book 3 and start tackling that. But that's the luxury of what I can do now, is kind of set my schedule.
Okay, next question. More writing questions. Did you have the story plotted out before you began, or did you build it as you went along?
So The Lost Apothecary, I had essentially a 1-page summary. So the short answer is no, the book was not outlined or plotted. I just knew the premise. I knew that kind of this discussion we've had about this apothecary who sells poisons. I knew there was going to be a high profile case that she was involved in that was going to potentially expose all of her secrets with huge, grave consequences, not only for her, but for hundreds of women across the city that she had assisted. So I knew that needed to happen about the middle of the book. And And then I knew that she was at some point going to be running from police, and that we would not find out what really happened to her until, we see the present day story that's happening 200 years later. So I knew that she would have secrets that would not be uncovered for the reader until very late in the book. Those are kind of the basic pillars that I knew, and I had to write the rest of it and figure out the rest of it, how I was going to get from A to B and B to C. So that was with the Lost Apothecary. But keep in mind, I did not have a deadline. I didn't have an agent. That was all just me working on my book too. And I had no idea what would happen with it. With the London Seance Society, once I sold that, part of the contract is there's a month in there that you have to have the first draft turned in. So I no longer had the luxury of saying, here are 3 big things that I want to happen, and I'm going to just, fiddle my way through it and figure out how to get there. Instead, I sat down, I spent a couple of weeks on an outline, and I worked on that outline with my agent and my editor. And then once we were all happy with it, I sat down to write, and the writing went remarkably faster. I drafted the entire book in 11 weeks because I knew what needed to happen in each scene. And I think from this point forward, I will outline my books because I expect to have deadlines on them. And although it's kind of tedious to work through the outline and sometimes things might change, it really does make for a more efficient writing process.
Okay. I want to remind people we still have time. So if you have more questions, put them in the chat. And I have a question about the current couple in the Lost Apothecary. Mm-hmm. How did you come up with the idea that it was supposed to be like romantic anniversary trip for them in terms of trying to fit the current in with the past?
Yeah, that's, it's funny. I've been asked so many questions. I don't think I've ever been asked that one. I knew that I wanted Caroline to be at a important juncture in her life. 10 years married, that's long enough that you don't just escape that marriage without really thinking through it. It's long enough that she was well into the decision, trying to make that decision about family planning and whether they wanted to have kids. It's long enough that they are very established and intertwined financially in their families. There are more consequences to leaving a marriage after 10 years than there are after 6 months or 1 year. So I also knew in chapter 2, which is Caroline's first chapter, it was going to be really compelling for the reader in that first paragraph to learn that it's her 10th wedding anniversary and she's in London, but the kicker is she's alone. That's a big deal. And that immediately tells you without telling, it tells the reader without meaning to tell the reader there's a problem. And so that just felt very impactful for me, to introduce her story that way.
Okay. There's some questions here about the vials and about the finding the vial and about Nella throwing the vial into the river, and how that tied together. And
I saw that question pop up a second ago, and it's actually short correction. It's Caroline that throws the vial back into the river. This is probably the most controversial thing that happens in the book. People do not like that she throws the vial back in. And I've actually thought about recording a YouTube video explaining why she does this, because to me, the logic is so obvious. So when I think about Caroline, she's got this vial at the end of the book, and she knows that it has changed Eliza's fate. And she knows now that it has changed her fate as well. So she basically has 2 options, and any of us would have these same 2 options. We can either bring the vial home and put it on our mantle to collect dust, and thereby we have ended the potential of this vial to do anything else again, ever. Or we can throw that vial back into the river, knowing what it has done for us, knowing what it has done for Eliza, and leave this huge door wide open that maybe that vial will change or affect some other woman's life down the road. And it feels like such a more interesting, hopeful, selfless option to give the vial back to the river. You know, she thinks that she found it because of fate. And so who's to say that fate's not going to bring it to somebody else down the road? And that's just such a more compelling option, in my opinion, than putting it on her mantle to look at. And I stand by my decision to have her throw it in the river. I can't fathom having made her brought that vial home. But I know that readers, they are often perturbed by that. So it's kind of an interesting question to get from readers, because I've had people get almost mad about it. And so that's my reasoning.
Oh, awesome. So also, is what happens to Nella purposefully ambiguous, or?
Yes. So there are several things throughout particularly the last 25% of the story that are purposely ambiguous. That's a very succinct way to put it. This book falls within the subgenre magical realism. And what that means is throughout various points in the story, the characters and therefore the readers are supposed to ask themselves, is what just happened the result of real life or magic? And is there something larger at play here? And Nella's fate, Eliza says at the end of the book that Nella still counsels her to this day. That single verb, counsels, I chose that very carefully. And the intent is for the reader to not know whether that means in a kind of ghostly spiritual way, or if that means in person that she, survived at the end. And that I love leaving that ambiguity open for the reader to decide. And I will say I do intend on writing a sequel to The Lost Apothecary someday, and it's going to be Eliza's story. And it will open most likely with Tom Pepper's death. And I hope to give readers some of the answers that they've been wanting about the various things in the book that are currently not answered. So I don't have any, firm plans to write that sequel. I don't have like a date or anything, but someday I absolutely want to do that.
So yeah, speaking of the characters, and this may be kind of like asking about your favorite child, but do you have a favorite character in The Lost Apothecary?
Yeah, absolutely. My favorite character is hands down Eliza, and she is most readers' favorite character as well. She's the only character I would consider writing a sequel about. I think that she was just such a breath of fresh air, particularly when set next to Nella's point of view, which was so dark and vengeful and heavy. And Eliza she brought a lightness to the story. She kind of sees the world through these rose-colored glasses, and often says things that are kind of witty or funny. And, even at the very beginning of the story, she draws her finger across the stone that is covered with this soot and ash in Nella's shop. And when she does that, she reveals the very clean white stone beneath. And that's a metaphor for what she does throughout the book. She kind of peels away the darkened layers of Nella's heart and shows that there's really some goodness and purity still left there. And for that reason, I just loved telling her story. And I'm excited to show in this future sequel that I'm alluding to, I'm excited to show her more of her young adulthood years and kind of her love story with Tom Pepper.
Oh, that sounds wonderful. Another question from the audience: Were you were you surprised after all the rejection of your first book when HarperCollins picked it up right away? And how was that?
Yeah, absolutely. I was surprised. My agent, so what happens when you sell a book? I don't think a lot of people realize this. You, as an author, you do not go directly to HarperCollins or Simon and Schuster with a manuscript. You get a literary agent first. And that is, in my opinion, the biggest battle, the biggest hurdle, because literary agents are just notoriously selective, which they can be and they should be. It's a difficult industry. But so I found my literary agent and I was so thrilled. And then what happens at that point is they take your book out on submission, which means that they start sending it to publishers. And my agent had a very specific submission strategy, meaning she knew which time of year she wanted to send it out. You wouldn't, for instance, send a book to editors a few days before Christmas because they're all going to be out of the office. So she knew when she wanted to send it. She had a list of editors that represent or that publish similar genres. So she had a targeted idea of which editors she wanted to send the manuscript to. But she told me that historical fiction, and remember, this was in late 2019. So this was pre-COVID. And she had told me that just the historical fiction space was strange. The types of books that publishers were buying was not consistent, and it was misaligned with what they'd seen in previous years. So she said, just don't get your hopes up. We don't know how long this might take to sell the book, and we don't know what kind of money it could bring in. So just keep your expectations very realistic. So to me, I thought, well, that means this book isn't going to ever even sell. Like this is, I need to really prepare myself for just further disappointment and keep working on the next book and see if maybe the next book is the one that sells. So that conversation all happened. And then the next day she calls me, and she said, well, it sold like overnight. So essentially the editor that ended up acquiring the book, she'd sent it to her that afternoon that she and I had that phone call. My editor read it overnight, said that she was up until about 2 a.m, finishing the manuscript. And then that next morning got authorization to send over a very healthy offer. So that all happened, in about a 24-hour period. My expectations were here. And then all of a sudden I get this crazy good news. I was in such a daze when my agent was relaying this good news that I didn't really have any recollection of any of the terms that she stated. And I was just pacing around my house in a total daze. And so I said, my agent's name is Stephanie. And I said, I'm so sorry, Stephanie, but I don't remember anything you just said. Can I call you back in 15 minutes and you go over all of these deal terms again? And she kind of laughed and said, yes, absolutely. So we hung up. I took 15 minutes to do some deep breathing exercises. I got a notebook and a pen and I called her back and she went through everything again. And I wrote it down this time. So that I will never forget that afternoon as long as I live. It was a life-changing phone call, truly. And nothing has been the same since. So that was very fun.
Yes. So this has just been so wonderful talking to you in person about your fantastic book, which I've read too, and I stayed up late, honestly, finishing it because I got to a certain point and I just had to know, right? So we're really looking forward to your next book when it comes out next spring, and possibly getting on your limited schedule for book talks. But it's been such a pleasure for talking with you today.
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Kevis. And thank you I know we've got a couple of individuals behind the scenes who are helping. I'm so appreciative. And for anybody who's tuning in, who's curious about where to find me, I'm all over social media. I also have a newsletter that you can subscribe to on my website. There's a lot of information on my website as well. If we have any aspiring writers or authors, there's some resources out there for you. And please feel free to interact on social media. I'm pretty active on Instagram in particular. So, but this has been really fun, and it's been so great to get all of these questions, and I really appreciate everybody tuning in.
Great, thank you again. And yeah, so I wanted to thank all of our audience for attending our event, and to Sarah for her great talk. And let you know a few things. Our next Friends at Home event will be May 11th at 7 p.m. with the outstanding docent Avril Angevin discussing the California ceramic tradition. Then on May 16th at 5 p.m., we will have Gail Tsukayama discussing her novel of Hawaiian plantation workers, The Color of Air. We hope you can join us for those events. Please consider a donation to the Friends of the Alameda Free Library at alamedafriends.com. This will allow us to continue to sponsor events such as these. Watch our website, newsletter, and Facebook page for additional events. A special appreciation to all of our Friends at Home team, particularly David Beal and Karen Manuel for helping with this event. And a special thanks to Sarah Penner for a wonderful program. Thank you for joining us today.